Hello, everybody. It's George from Ireland. How are you? There's also a bit of a time lag at the beginning because I can't see up there. The seconds have started going, and I'm told not to start speaking immediately. Otherwise, when you first hear me, I'm part of the halfway through the first word, hello. You get low. Yeah, I'm George from Ireland, like that. Anyway, so this video is all about the Black Sea Grain Initiative and how it's just been prolonged. So this was agreed back in July 2022. Of course, Ukraine's littoral is on the Black Sea. Some of it's the Sea of Azov, which is a semi-enclosed section of the Black Sea. And Ukraine produces about 20% of all the grain in the world. So it was the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, of the Russian Empire at times, and obviously the Republic of Ukraine has been independent since 1991. Russia managed to seize much of the Ukrainian coast over the last 9 years. Obviously, Crimea in in 2014, and a lot of the rest of the coast in 2022, particularly around the Sea of Azov. And they wanted to seize the entire Ukrainian coastline, make Ukraine a landlocked country, because most of Ukraine's grain was exported by sea. So it was shipped out from Odessa, Chernomorsk, Mariupol. What's the other one beginning with an M in the east? Or Berdyansk, not that begins with an M. And I can't remember the other one, Chunze, something like that. Through the Bosphorus, that's that very narrow strait in Istanbul, Turkey, only 800 meters across at its narrowest point, to the Aegean Sea, out to the Mediterranean Sea, and then all over the world. You could go through the Straits of Gibraltar to the Atlantic. You could go through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, onto the Indian Ocean, wherever. So because Ukraine had lost a lot of its ports, it therefore lost much of its capacity to ship Ukraine's grain abroad. And indeed, the Russians were stealing Ukrainian grain and shipping it out from Crimea and selling it and taking the profit themselves. Although, I mean, I obviously think that Russia was wrong to begin this war, illegal, unprovoked war of aggression, all the rest of it. But fair enough, one does seize enemy assets in wartime and use them for one's own purposes. That offense, I don't really complain about that one. And I suppose hungry people were at least getting the food at the end. So a deal was reached, I think, in July last year, initially, the Ukrainian Grain Initiative, or the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So Ukraine's corn, wheat, and sunflower oil could be shipped out, and the Russians would agree not to sink these merchant ships from neutral countries. The Ruskies should inspect them when they're arriving at Ukrainian ports, inspect them out at sea, check that they weren't carrying weapons in for the Ukrainians, and when they're coming out, possibly inspect them again to see they're not exporting something they shouldn't be exporting. And Turkey is facilitating this because it's going through the Bosphorus, that waterway in the middle of Istanbul, Turkey. Now, Ukraine and Russia didn't agree with each other. They both signed separate agreements with the United Nations. And this was vital because some of the global south is heavily dependent on these exports. Bangladesh, Egypt, China, Lebanon are particularly heavily dependent on Ukrainian corn, wheat, and sunflower oil. But some of the wealthier Western countries like Italy, Spain, the Netherlands are reliant on them. Turkey was not really a global south country. It's not a rich Western country, but Turkey had an interest in this because they buy quite a lot of Ukrainian foodstuffs themselves. So this agreement had been due to expire on the 18th of March this year. There was obviously the possibility it would be extended, but the Russians were saying they may not allow it to be extended. They could block these merchant ships. They could even sink these merchant ships. They didn't actually say that latter bit. If there was not some concessions for them, but they weren't too vociferous about it. I wasn't sure which way they were going to go. In the end, they have agreed to it. I suppose they don't want to make themselves even more unpopular than they already are. They particularly pitched to the global south, like at that G20 agreement, saying, oh, these evil Western colonialists, you must be against them. But then if you were to starve people to death in less economically developed countries, it's not a good look. You might say, could Ukraine not export this grain by land? Well, it can export some overland. It did so even before the war, but not very much. There's limited road and rail capacity. They have only so many trains, which are obviously busy carrying troops and munitions. Even though there are only so many tons of grain you can put on a train, for safety reasons, there are only so many trains you can put down a railway line per hour. Otherwise, they get too close and there's a risk of them crashing. The front one has to put on the brakes, and the other one puts on the brakes too late, can crash into the rear end of it. But you can export things by train and truck. but the road and rail capacity is not enough for them to export the most of their grain that way. Obviously more expensive in terms of fuel because, gravity is working against you, because the ship, once you're actually on the water is taking, most of the weight, just as long as you have the ship moving forward, and that's it. There's less friction, and the ships can export so many tons of grain. Well, that's another thing. Is some they've exported just a little bit of it just over the border to Romania, and it's been shipped out from there again. But so this has been extended, and there were frenetic negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland, at Palais des Nations, the quantum headquarters of the League of Nations from the 1920s and 30s. And finally, an agreement was reached. However, unlike last time, when the agreement was prolonged for 120 days, in November 2022, this time it's been extended for only 60 days. So many people have breathed a sigh of relief that Moscow has not thwarted it. But the Russian representatives, they were holding meetings with the United Nations humanitarian supremo, and that's why they signed the agreement. I suppose they were persuaded this would be a humanitarian gesture. So they've done that partly not to lose all their soft power. But they say that in future, if they to agree to it being extended for a more significant length of time, then they want to see tangible headway on loosening sanctions on Russia. And only then will they permit the Black Sea Grain Initiative to be extended for a more considerable length of time. Because, Russia's cut off from SWIFT. So its bank payments are wrecked. Its use of China's Union Pay is only semi-effective. It's got some system where it can send and receive money from former Soviet countries like Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and some Russians have met in the United Kingdom saying they've got bank accounts in Kazakhstan, even though they've never been there, to circumvent the financial sanctions. But, Western countries might get smart and crack down on Kazakhstan secondary sanctions. You can't do that. You'll be cut off from SWIFT yourself or whatever. And you'll have to choose to do, either trade with NATO and EU countries who represent something like 70% of the world's economy, or you can trade with Russia, which represents about 3% of the world's economy. Which would you rather? Okay, so and is there anything else to consider? Yeah, Russia exports quite a lot of corn and wheat itself, some sunflower oil, fertilizer, potash, and so on. Belarus also exports, or used to export, considerable quantities of potash. And ammonia is exported from Russia, from Tolyatti, this city, named in honor of an Italian communist, down a pipeline to Odessa, one of the few Ukrainian ports which are still in Ukrainian hands. And they say, well, that's not being exported, and we want obviously they want to make money, but Western countries, they want to cut off Russia from the finances which allow it to prosecute its war. We'll see what's going to happen in 60 days, is anybody's guess. But so far, over 24 million tons of grain were exported pursuant to the Black Sea Grain Initiative since July 2022 up until the present time. So, So the Ukrainian economy shrank 30% in 2022. The Russian economy, even the Russians, a bit by at least 2%, considerably more, estimates over 10%. I'll probably go for the middle of that range, something like 7%. But the Ukrainians, obviously, they desperately need grain exports. They've got some money. I know they're getting a lot of arms for free, and the European Union is giving 6 billion euros a month just to sustain themselves, just to pay for essential maintenance, pay salaries, and so on. But they don't want to have to impose on the largesse of the European Union overmuch, which might be stretched. Some voices of the EU saying, well, should we be paying this? Why don't we look after our own people? All right, thank you so much for watching the channel. Goodbye, everyone.